Everyone, thank you so much for joining us for Resilient Cape Canaveral Phase 2. Tonight, we'd like you to answer a couple questions. If you could go to menti.com and use the code 306721-8 and answer a couple of questions that we have for you. This code will be available for the next 12 days. So you can go in and answer it at your leisure over that time. So the first question while we wait for everyone to come in is, how long have you lived in Cape Canaveral? So if you could fill in those answers, 0 to 1 year, 2 to 5 years, 6 to 10, 11 to 15, or over 15 years. The second question we'd like you to answer is, how would you best describe yourself? As a resident, a business owner, or other? Great. And with that, I will hand it over to the City of Cape Canaveral's Brenda to get us started.
Hello, everyone. My name is Brenda Defoe-Supernaut. I am the city planner with the City of Cape Canaveral, and I am working on this project with the Regional Planning Council. And I'm going to give an overview of the grant and then a brief history of how we got to where we are. Next slide. This is our agenda for the evening. As I said, my name is Brenda. I am the city planner. We will be followed by John and Tara from the Regional Planning Council, and then Jerry Murphy from UF. When we conclude, we'll discuss next steps if there are any, and then any questions and answers. Okay, so in 2015, the state legislature, the state of Florida's legislature directed jurisdictions like the City of Cape Canaveral that have a coastal element as part of their comprehensive plan, that they need to include components that address unsafe development in coastal areas. This was achieved through section 163.7138 of the Florida statute, and this established the parallel flood legislation, which essentially says that cities and coastal municipalities need to use data and science to address flooding in these areas. Next slide. So as a reaction to this, or as an answer to this, in 2017, the City of Cape Canaveral adopted Ordinance 10-2017, where it updated its comprehensive plan to include the coastal management element. And within that, we included a couple of provisions. I would say these were essentially a baseline for us to start so that we could come into compliance with peril of flood. And it included development and redevelopment principles and strategies. And it also discussed possible engineering solutions that we might explore to reduce the risk of flooding. Next slide. In 2018, we were awarded a grant, again, with the Regional Planning Council, the East Central Florida Regional Planning Council. This grant was funded by the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. And in the report, we examined the impacts of sea level rise and flooding in Cape Canaveral, and we identified where the vulnerabilities are. I think many of you know by now that the city is a barrier island, so we have a lot of risks. We have some challenges, but I think we're pretty poised to meet most of those. Next. So this is the Resilient Cape Canaveral vulnerability assessment. And the first image on the far left is the cover of the report. And then the two next images are kind of our high and low ranges for sea level rise. We use two measures. We're using the US Army Corps and then NOAA. And generally, the ranges that we have for these models are between 5 and 8 feet. And we're using this as our basis to build kind of our analysis and our data to inform decisions in planning in the City of Cape Canaveral. Next slide. Which leads us to today. This project that we're doing with the comprehensive plan is essentially to look at our coastal element again. We're also going to be looking at our land development codes, also known as the City Code of Ordinances. We're going to be looking at our stormwater management plan and any other policies that we have in place and make sure that they are in line with peril of flood and that they also are in line with the challenges we potentially face in the future. This is going to dig a little deeper into where we see ourselves going as a city in the next 5, 10, 15 years. And eventually we'll use this as a basis, I think, for the next generation of planning in the city. Next slide. That's all I have for you today. John and Tara are going to get a little bit deeper into the growth management, the comprehensive plan, and then what we're actually doing in this project.
Thank you, Brenda. So if you do have any questions for Brenda as part of her presentation, please go ahead and put those questions in the chat box, and we'll just go through all of the questions at the end of the webinar. And there is one more question, another question we'd like you to answer, and I'm going to go ahead and actually open up Menti because I did see a couple people come in. So based upon what Brenda had talked about and some of the other resilience work underway in the city, how would you describe your knowledge of resilience work underway? You're fully engaged, knowledgeable. I am somewhat engaged and knowledgeable, and this is all new to me. So I'm going to stop sharing for a minute while I open up those surveys and let people actually answer them as we go through a little bit. Okay. All right, and with that, I'm going to hand it over to John, a planner at the East Central Florida Regional Planning Council, to talk about growth management and comprehensive planning in Florida, to provide the framework of why we're doing this and the role that the comprehensive plan plays in resilience for this city. John?
Yes, good evening and welcome. And tonight I'll be focusing on a little bit of a brief history of growth management and comprehensive planning in Florida, as the coastal element and perils of flood are part of the coastal element for the city. And the brief history, thank you, goes back to starting in 1972 when Florida really became a leader in growth management in the United States under Governor Askew. At that time, we had the Environmental Land and Water Management Act of 1972, as well as the Water Resources Act of 1972. This was followed up by what really became the capstone of Florida's growth management in this period, 1985, the Local Government Comprehensive Planning Act under Governor Graham. And that established some of the meat and potatoes of the growth management plan we'll be discussing in a few moments. And everything was pretty quiet with that until about 2011 with the Community Planning Act of 2011 under Governor Scott. At that time, it greatly reduced the state role in planning, also disbanded the Department of Community Affairs as a separate agency, put it in with the Department of Economic Opportunity, as well as to make some other changes we'll discuss. Next slide, please. I just wanted to briefly go over this with you. The Environmental Land Management Act of 72 is very important. In several ways, it created the areas of critical state concern, which we still use, and the developments of regional impact, which was around until a few years back. Well, that was basically something that hailed the developments that were based on their uses or their location, impacted more than one county or region. Florida Water Resources Act of 1972 came next, and it declared its waters of the state to be resources that were very essential to the state and were to be managed for the public, and it created the 5 water management districts as a way of carrying out that. The Local Government Comprehensive Planning Act of 75 was the first time where local governments were required to create comprehensive plans. In 1984, there was the State Regional and Planning Act, which required the state agencies, and regional councils to create comprehensive plans. We finally did come around in 1985 to the Local Government Comprehensive Planning and Land Development Act. It really was the meat and potatoes of growth management in Florida. it required the local governments to comply with state and regional plans. It created the idea of concurrency, where the infrastructure had to be in place to handle development at the time of development. Also created a state review process where all plans had to be approved by the state, making sure that all plans were meeting the requirements for comprehensive plans, as well as being in line with the state and other plans. The Community Planning Act of 2011 changed that somewhat. It got rid of concurrency or having to have the infrastructure in place at the time of development for transportation, schools, and parks, and it made those optional. It also eliminated the restrictions that used to exist on the number, and it did away with the idea of a time frame of when comprehensive plans could be changed. Now they can be changed as many times a year as you want at any time. Also created an expedited review process. And in 2015, as well as having the perils of flood legislation come in, that same year, the DRI process was done away with. Next slide, please. Thank you. And this is just a overview of some of the state regulations that municipalities such as Cape Canaveral have to comply with. This is part 2 of chapter 163. And it may look like a lot, but unfortunately for us planners, what's highlighted in yellow is the primary important things to us. So let's go over real briefly. Section 163.3164 basically defines the main definitions related to comprehensive planning and growth management. Then you get into section 163.3177, required optional elements for the comprehensive plans. Section 163.3191, which goes over the evaluation and appraisal of the comprehensive plan. That's where every 7 years, comprehensive plans are updated by governments and reviewed by the state. And finally, section 163.3225 goes over public hearing processes. Next slide, please. And with this slide, you hear are the actual individual elements that each community has to meet. And in the case of Cape Canaveral, some non-coastal communities don't have the coastal element. You do have that one, as well as the optional elements. The transportation concurrencies optional, as is the school public facilities is now optional. In the past, that was required. Next slide, please. And the good news is your plan is all in compliance. Here's a copy of the comprehensive plan for the city of Cape Canaveral, and you can see you've got all the elements you need there, including some of the previous ones that are no longer required, like the public schools facilities element. Next slide, please. And two things that really are important here in the comprehensive plan. You start with the data analysis, which basically updates where the community is, where it's been in the past, where things are now, and where you would like to go in the future. And the second section we deal with is goals, objectives, and policies, which are the actual plans for dealing with the changes in population, infrastructure need, and the resources. Next slide, please. And I start off with the data analysis section, which is, it does have text, but it's largely tables and maps. That's really the important thing of that, dealing with issues such as population, infrastructure, and assets. The data is required by the state to be from a reliable source or created in-house using accepted methodologies. Common sources here in the state of Florida include the U.S. Census Bureau, the University of Florida's Bureau of Economic and Business Research, or BEBR, and also the University of Florida's Schimberg Center for Housing Studies. We use especially the Beaver and the Schimberg Center, quite a bit. Now we get into the actual goals, objectives, and the policies. The meat and potatoes, they basically go from the very broad to more general. You start with your broadest, which are the goals, working your way over to the policies. Florida statutes for the goals, it describes it as meaning the long-term ends toward which programs or activities are ultimately directed. And I'd like to give a brief example from the coastal element for the city of Cape Canaveral. Coastal Management Goal CM1 is provide for the preservation and conservation of the city's coastal resources so that the economic, social, and or aesthetic value which these resources provide to communities are not destroyed and are available for future generations. Next are the objectives, and as defined by state statutes, these refer to a specific measuring intermediate end that is achievable and marks progress towards the goal. An example of this one would be objective CM 1-1 from the comprehensive plan, City of Cape Canaveral. The city shall protect, conserve, or enhance the two remaining coastal wetlands, living marine resources, coastal barriers, and wildlife habitat. The measurement of its objectives is the extent to which these resources are protected, conserved, or enhanced, and a degree to which the following policies are implemented. And that leads us to the third part of the goals, objectives, and policies, the policies themselves. And there's under section 163.3164, parent 37, policies defined as the way in which programs and activities are conducted to actually achieve the goal, the identified goal. An example of that would be policy CM 1.1.1 of the comprehensive plan, City of Cape Canaveral. The city shall protect, conserve, and where possible, seek restoration of the vital areas of the coastal zone, including, as appropriate, wetlands, water quality, wildlife habitat, living marine resources such as manatees, beaches, and dune systems. The city shall promote protection of environmentally sensitive areas, beach preservation, and tree protection. Next slide, forward. And finally, as I mentioned previously, we do have the evaluation and appraisal report, which under the Florida statutes, section 163.3191, parens 1 through 5, requires that every 7 years, all the counties and cities in the state update their comprehensive plan. Basically, the document updates the plan to reflect changes in state law that have occurred since the previous plan was adopted, as well as changes in the community's conditions, or just in general, the way the community wishes to go as far as growth is concerned. And the evaluation appraisal report, or the EAR, covers 2 planning periods: the short term, the first 5 years, which deals more with the capital improvements type elements, which the capital improvement program is usually a 5-year program for communities. And then there's a second subsequent 10-year period for a total of a 15-year planning period that the evaluation and appraisal report covers. And you're in good shape. You're at the year for the City of Cape Canaveral, as you covered, until 2025. So it'll be a few years before you'll have to begin that exercise again. And that concludes what I have for today.
Thank you so much, John. And again, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box and we will address them at the end of the webinar. So another question that we have is, how familiar are you with green infrastructure options, such as rain gardens and bioswales, for addressing stormwater drainage and water quality issues? So very familiar, somewhat familiar, and not very familiar, or not familiar at all. So, so with that, again, my name is Tara McHugh. I'm the Director of Planning at the East Central Florida Regional Planning Council. And so with all of what Brenda and John had said, it leads us into basically Resilient Cape Canaveral Phase 2. So my question now is, have you participated in the Resilient Cape Canaveral project previously in the Phase 1? And I'll go over some of those activities that we did in just a moment. I am going to, however, continue that voting. So if you guys want to answer those questions are completely open for you. All right. So with that, I will, okay. So Phase 1 really was a lot about public engagement. This chart may be familiar if you participated in those workshops, because we talked about how it's a never-ending cycle when it comes to planning, especially resilience planning. There are 5 main components: public education, vulnerability assessment, strategy development, policy updates, and then implementation. And of course, you continue to have to go back to public engagement and continue that process. So our last project really focused on public engagement. We had a kickoff workshop, and we had people, we presented what some of the initial vulnerabilities were that we identified. We talked about sea level rise, we talked about flooding, where this may occur. We had a lot of activities that really engaged people in, well, how do we solve these problems? How do we create a more resilient Cape Canaveral through your policies and your land development codes? We asked them where they would want to maybe implement some green infrastructure projects, where they thought the city could focus redevelopment, knowing where some of the hazards are. And then where just general resilience measures could be taken. And so that's that map on the left. We talked about strategies, and then what we did was we took all of that information and created a Resilient Cape Canaveral survey. So we wanted to make sure that we could reach as many people in the city as possible, business owners as well as residents. So hopefully this screen conjures up some memories of you guys taking it. We looked at vulnerabilities. We asked stakeholders what they felt were the greatest vulnerabilities and prioritize them for the city. And then related to that, what kind of strategies they could really get behind and they thought would work for the city of Cape Canaveral as related to those vulnerabilities. City opportunities. So how can the city move that forward? What kind of programs, what kind of low-hanging fruit and changes can the city overall make? And then obviously we asked for some wrap-up information from the people who took the survey. The project also, as Brenda talked about, included a vulnerability assessment. Some previous work of the Regional Planning Council and stakeholder throughout Brevard and Volusia County, including the city, as well as DOT, the TPOs, Water Management District, DEP, you name it, they were probably there. The Cape was there, NASA, they were all there and participated. One of the things that came out of that was a regional approach to sea level rise. So using the Army Corps high projection curves as our lower boundary and the NOAA high as our upper boundaries, this was promoted and is now currently being used across the region as other cities continue to do their vulnerability assessments and policy updates. So utilizing those curves, like Brenda said, we looked at where impacts were going to be within the city. Just for some images, this is what we will be looking at. Within the next about 10 years is what's anticipated with 1 foot of sea level rise. And then this would be about 4 feet of sea level rise within the city. You can see a lot of it is based around the lagoon. And and then cuts over a little bit at about 4 feet down the center spine through the canal. The final report for Resilient Cape Canaveral was finished in 2019. And so it talks about all the vulnerability assessments. It also includes the findings from our stakeholder engagement, and then a variety of recommendations that we suggested as result from all of that input. And some of that was to look at the comprehensive plan and the land development plans to see where we can incorporate some of these strategies. So based upon all of those recommendations you got and your input, we looked at the strategies that the city came back with. And again, that's where we are moving forward now. The next couple of screens are the top ranking strategies per vulnerability that came out from the survey that was distributed to residents and businesses in the city. The green arrows represent the strategies we are trying to incorporate through this project, either in land development codes or stormwater master plan recommendations, or in the comprehensive plan itself. The number one vulnerability that was identified was the health and functionality of the Indian River Lagoon. But then when you look at some of the other vulnerabilities, some of those strategies, they overlap, which is really good because you can try and tackle a couple problems with one strategy or one policy or direction. So some of the strategies that we're looking at is encouraging natural vegetation buffer between the lagoon and turf, so you're not having runoff of pesticides directly into the lagoon. Encourage low impact development standards throughout the city. Encourage the use of vegetative solutions along both the lagoon as well as the beach side. There was the need to identify gaps in critical infrastructure to help with storm preparedness and recovery. So knowing what infrastructure is vulnerable is really important. Again, adapt building and land development codes for greater resilience. So that's something that could go into the land development code as we assess that. When it comes to climate change, which was ranked as the third vulnerability within the city, is to assess the city policies to address climate change and sustainability. And that's what Jerry will be talking about in a few moments in the work that he's doing up at UF. Green infrastructure was a direction that everybody wanted to go. It ranked pretty high as far as the strategies, increasing green space for stormwater retention. Of course, that is difficult in a city that is built out like Cape Canaveral. So being able to utilize any existing space is going to be really important. And again, that's really looking at the land development code and how that can be captured. And again, that leads to the innovative approaches for flood resilient structures and smart growth. So you can see how they're kind of tied together. And then develop an infrastructure plan that incorporates gray and green practices. So the city is definitely in those conversations to help advance those strategies. And then finally, sea level rise. Creating a hybrid stormwater solution, again, same as the green infrastructure, so that's a very similar strategy. Update codes and policies to redirect development away from hazard areas, and then look into creating adaptation action areas, which are special areas to consider sea level rise regarding infrastructure, zoning, and building standards. And so these are what we're looking to move forward through the work that we're doing now. When it came to what are opportunities that the city could move forward, again, a lot of the same things boil to the top about creating a more hybrid approach to your stormwater master plan, and then really utilizing green infrastructure to improve the stormwater train and improve water quality, but also creating green space where people could utilize it when it was dry, or even when it was wet, as long as the walkways weren't covered in water. Low impact development also was really important. So again, looking at the codes and policies to where they can be adjusted to techniques that emphasize conservation and use of on-site natural features in order to protect water quality and manage stormwater runoff. There was the idea of increasing elevation of buildings and facilities, so allowing that in the code, so assessing how that could be done. And then number 7 is the last one with the green arrow, again, is looking at an adaptation action area. And again, that is something that we're working on through this project. So that brings us to, we have all of our strategies, but now we got to put it into our plans and policies or they're never going to be implemented. And so that brings us to our 2020 Resilient Cape Canaveral project. Again, it was funded through the FDEP Resilient Coastline Program. So of course, we're always thankful to DEP for their funding. It is a partnership between the city as well as the East Central Florida Regional Planning Council and the University of Florida. We will, through this process, again, continue to engage and educate stakeholders, citizens, residents, business owners of Cape Canaveral and get your input on the right direction for the city to move. As Brenda talked about earlier, this city had incorporated some language to be compliant with peril of flood, but based upon the work that we had done in 18 and 19, we really want to readdress those policies to make sure we're getting those strategies that boil to the top into the comprehensive plan. And then as Jerry will talk about, we are looking at other plans and assessing those to see how we can integrate resilience across the board and make sure that the plans cohesively work together and don't prevent the city from moving in a good direction. So as we move forward, the things to remember in this project is really related to the peril of flood policies, and they're pretty specific. We need to develop principles and strategies for development and redevelopment that reduce flood risks from high tides, storm surge, flash floods, stormwater runoff, and sea level rise. So we actually have to have techniques, best practices, ways that the city is going to make development function and build in the city moving forward to make it more resilient. Adaptation action areas did come up a lot, like I had talked about, and that was an optional step that coastal communities could take, and it was brought out in 2011. And really, it is a designation of an area in a jurisdiction which identifies an area that is vulnerable to coastal flooding, high tide, storm surge, and sea level rise. But the main idea is that the purpose of this is to prioritize funding for infrastructure needs and adaptation planning. So it's very specific in how this adaptation action area, how it functions and what its goals are. So again, just a reminder, put any questions into the chat box. And then the final question we have for UF is, in thinking about your community plans, how well aligned do you think they are to achieve the goal of resilience to future disasters? And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jerry.
Thanks, Tara. So I'm Jerry Murphy with the University of Florida. I'm a faculty consultant for the Program for Resource Efficient Communities in IFAS Extension. And I'm going to talk tonight about Plan Integration for Resilience Scorecard. And this is a new tool that we're introducing to the region to assist with aligning the several plans that every community in Florida has. John talked about the comprehensive plan. Next slide. And, planning is the key to resilience. We're living in hazardous times, as COVID-19 has taught us, and so we need to be prepared for that. Sea level rise and climate change is probably a bigger concept than a pandemic, really, because it's an ongoing, inevitable sort of change, and we need to try and integrate hazards and climate change into our plans to make sure that we can affect future resilience. Next slide. So the project objectives for the Plan Integration for Resilience Scorecard are to evaluate the coordination of Cape Canaveral's network of plans. And we'll do this by looking at the different networks and seeing where they target the most vulnerable areas. If they're addressing the vulnerability that's come out of the work that the Central Florida Regional Planning Council has done with the resilience for Cape Canaveral, and also to better understand the relationship between the hazards and the policies. So John mentioned goals, objectives, policies, and strategies. Our focus will be primarily on policies and strategies, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. Next slide, please. So part of the network of plans that we're looking at, obviously the comprehensive plan that was updated in 2018. That'll be a focus of what we're doing in terms of policy work. We're also going to look at the City of Cape Canaveral Basin Management Action Plan, Compliance Strategy Final Report, which we call the Stormwater Master Plan for short. That has a number of different strategies that are presented in it as recommendations, but we need to evaluate them against the vulnerability assessment that's been done through the Resilient Cape Canaveral Plan in 2019 to see if those projects are viable in a sea level rise inundation scenario, if they would still be effective for a reasonable period of time to establish a return on investment. We'll also be looking at the Brevard County Local Hazard Mitigation Strategy, or what we call the LMS. This is the mitigation plan, hazard mitigation plan that's required by the state and FEMA for the city to be eligible for hazard mitigation grants under FEMA's various programs. And while that's Brevard County wide, we're going to look at how that affects the comprehensive plan and everything, all these other plans in terms of, do they coordinate, are they integrated, or are they contradictory? And do they support moving away from being vulnerable and addressing hazards? And the scorecard basically scores these as a positive, a negative, or neutral. And that's how we'll basically, that's the lens that we'll evaluate all of this network of plans for. And then we're focusing on some of the identified land development regulations, the A1A Economic Opportunity Overlay District, or the EOOD, also Chapter 90, which addresses floods, portions of Chapter 82 addressing building regulations and coastal development regulations. And this is all part of a cycle of planning. So as John mentioned, the comprehensive plan was updated in 2018. It's not due for another evaluation and appraisal review or an year until 2025. The 2014 Stormwater Master Plan obviously was not done under the lens of the Resilient Cape Canaveral study. So the sea level rise aspect was not explored as much as it can be now that that assessment has been done. And I mentioned we'll be looking at that. We also are required, the local mitigation strategy is required to be updated annually. So all of these plans are in a constant cycle of planning. And it's good to take a step back, and that's kind of what we're doing here, to see how they align and make sure that they don't contradict each other or make policies that are impossible to interpret without running into conflicts. Next slide. So when we're evaluating these plans and policies, did I say next slide? We're trying to identify the relevant policies, and these should be place specific. We should be able to identify what the area is. It may be citywide, it may be an area of the city, but if it's general and not geographic, it will not be helpful in looking at resilience. And then we want to see, like I mentioned, the +1, -1, or neutral, whether they reduce or increase the vulnerability to hazards. And then we want to make sure that they contain a recognizable policy tool so that the government intervention is specific and there is an actual activity that can be identified.
Jerry,
next slide.
Jerry, just want to make sure I'm on the right slide. It should say identifying policies. Is that correct?
We should go to the next one.
Okay.
One more, Tara?
It says
There we
types
go.
okay.
And these are the various, I'm sorry? These are the various types of policy tools that we're going to be looking at. You know, development regulations, that's your code of ordinances, or land development regulations, land development code, goes by a lot of different terms. Land acquisition, which always involves dollars. So it's always a difficult conversation to have. Density transfer provisions, which are a creative tool to help look at how we might manage a adjustment to future sea level rise. There's financial incentives and penalties that come through the regulations that are mentioned at the top. Land use analysis and the permitting process, always trying to look at site plans to make sure that they're satisfying all the criteria in the comprehensive plan, addressing conservation of natural resources, coastal management, stormwater infrastructure. Those are your public facilities. And we should include housing when we think of public facilities, because that's part of the mix of where we live and how we interact with the land. Post-disaster reconstruction decisions, you have a comprehensive plan policy that talks about developing a post-disaster redevelopment plan. And then finally, capital improvements, another aspect of money usually addressed in the budget annually to see what can be constructed out of that budget. Next slide. And so this is kind of the way we look at the ongoing cycle of addressing disasters. You have your tools on the left side, comprehensive plan, stormwater master plan, the local mitigation strategy. And then there's an event, a disaster event. And so the initial phase to that is a response. Then there's short-term recovery. So responding is how we get through the event and try and keep people as safe as possible. Evacuation is part of response. Short-term recovery is then how much is the disaster impacted our infrastructure and our housing inventory, all of the various mechanisms that make up for a city life. We look at that in the short-term recovery, and then where a major impact has occurred, or where we have to look at retooling infrastructure, rebuilding infrastructure.
Jerry, did we lose you? Oh no. Oh, there we go.
Dropped and
You there?
I'm here.
Okay. All right. You can go ahead and keep going where you left off.
Okay. Well, where did I leave off? Because I think I dropped.
Talk about the short-term recovery.
Short-term recovery. Okay, so short-term recovery is after the initial response. It's looking at assessing, you're doing a damage assessment, looking at what has been affected by the event, the disaster event, and trying to get back to normal as quickly as possible. We've been doing a lot of getting back to normal as quickly as possible lately. And so it's the same kind of thing. It's just a different type of event. And then long-term recovery is looking at major infrastructure, major areas of damage, how we address those, how we get people in homes that have had homes destroyed, if that's the case, things that take a little bit more than just a few months. And that long-term recovery is part of what the post-disaster redevelopment plan is to help us address. We look at the worst case scenarios in certain events and try and develop some policies so that when those events occur, we're prepared to answer the questions that may be difficult and may be complicated, but we've taken the time to assess that situation and prepared for some options in the event. And that's sort of the mitigation resilience continuum, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much. So if John and Brenda, if you want to come back on live. if you can. We have no questions in the question and answer box. And so then at this point in time, so Brenda, I'll hand it back to you just for our next steps.
Sure. So continuing from here, we're going to continue to assess our plans like Tara mentioned, and then we're going to try to flesh out some concrete policies. We're going to continue to work with the Regional Planning Council, and we also have another project that we're kind of doing simultaneously with Stetson, where we're going to be looking at nature-based solutions in a specific area. So we'll be looking at that. That's a little more of a long-term project. It's going to occur over a few years, but it's a really exciting research project. I'm hoping the results of that will help us be better guided in the future. And then we'll be having another event. This will be more of an open house. The intention is to have it at Manatee, so we can socially distance and do that as safe as possible. It'll be outdoor and it will be a little more informal and fluid and kind of come as you are, and we'll have some displays and more items to discuss in terms of green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. That's all I have for now.
Great, thank you so much, Brenda, John, and Jerry. And so if there are any questions after this recording, feel free to reach out to Brenda over at the city, and she will help to answer those questions, or reach out to one of us to get the answer for you. So with that, we hope that you have an amazing rest of your evening. Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.